Republicans in Texas have hit a major stumbling block in their attempts to introduce some of the strictest voting laws in the US. It's after their Democratic colleagues walked off the State House floor late on Sunday night, meaning that there weren't the numbers required to pass the bill before a midnight deadline.
Now, critics say the changes would disproportionately affect minorities and people with disabilities. What's actually in this bill? Well, it's known as SB7. Let's just have a look at it. The window to request absentee ballots would be shortened. Partisan watchers at the polling stations, they'd be allowed to get closer to the people actually voting. Also, drive-through voting and 24-hour voting would be eliminated. Both of those are things that Harris County, a Democratic stronghold, introduced last year. And on that topic of voting windows, early voting on Sundays also could not begin before 1 p.m. It's something opponents of the bill say would depress turnout among black churchgoers who cast their ballot after morning worship services.
Well, let's bring in Glenn Smith, Democratic strategist for the Liberal advocacy group Progress Texas. Glenn, thank you very much for joining us. This is probably no more than a delay. So what have Democrats actually achieved?
Oh, they've achieved a lot. It was a major victory. Let's put this in the context that the fight for voting rights has existed as long as the United States has existed. It took decades and decades for women to get the right to vote here. It took decades and decades, and then again, even more decades to protect the rights of African Americans and other minorities to vote. There's not going to be a final victory. We have to take every victory a day at a time, and this was a major setback for the Republicans, whose bill was probably one of the worst and most anti-minority, anti-democracy, anti-voting rights bill since mid-20th century at least.
Do you think that the Democrats' win, as you frame it, in this instance, is a sign of just the changing demographics across these states that were once solidly Republican, like Texas?
Well, in the sense that Republicans are trying to put barriers between voters and the ballot box, yes, it is a result of that, because Republicans can see that their natural base, which is largely rural, largely white, largely older, are going to lose out to the increasingly majority-minority populations of the major urban areas in Texas. Houston, for instance, in Harris County, you mentioned Harris County, is perhaps and might be the most diverse population in America. So they're trying to protect against that because they don't get those votes.
Glenn, I mean, I just want to come back to what Jane said at the top there. There'll be a lot of people who don't like this. The bottom line is, though, they're going to push it through, so they will get what they want.
Well, that's not certain, but I will tell you this. You have to fight it. You can't be afraid of what might happen down the road. You can't get timid and skip a fight because you're afraid something else might come your way down the road. You have to fight these battles. You have to show them that you're really tough enough and you'll stand up to them. One of the consequences of this fight, however, played into their failure to pass it. By standing up to them, they didn't expect us to be as strong as we were. They made a good number of mistakes, most of them like clerical mistakes, so they didn't get the paperwork done on time. In this instance, because they didn't get the paperwork done on time, the bill wasn't eligible to be heard until last night, shortening the amount of time before the deadline at midnight. That was the Republicans' fault.
Let me just ask you then, Glenn, on the assumption it does go through, how much of an impact really do you think this might have on voters and on their understanding perhaps as to how they need to vote, when they need to vote?
If it went through in this form, it would have a major impact on minority voting rights. It would significant barriers between minorities in the ballot box if it was in this form. I'm not sure the courts would let it stand in this form if it passed. And we have to remember that there is a move in the United States Congress to pass a new Voting Rights Act that would prohibit almost all the provisions of Republicans included in this bill. But if it passed and became the law, it would have a significant impact on voting rights. There's no question about it.
That brings me neatly onto the final point, Glenn, and very briefly, a lot of people looking at this will say, well, how does Texas get to dictate its own voting restrictions or voting legislation? Why doesn't the federal government just step in and create some kind of unified election policy?
Well, that's part of what the John Lewis Act, the Voting Rights Act, would do, was give the federal government a bigger hand. We used to have that with the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. Any changes in voting laws like these had to be approved by the U.S. Justice Department. so to make sure they weren't discriminatory. So in states have, in the United States, states have the ability to run their own elections, but they have to do so under the guidelines in terms of the U.S. Constitution and existing voting rights laws. So ultimately, the federal government should do what you're suggesting, but I don't know when that will happen.
Like all things in American politics, to be decided. Glenn Smith, thank you very much indeed for joining us.